Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a book launch event of the Regent College Bookstore at Regent College, Vancouver, BC, wherever you're joining us all over the world. Welcome to a conversation about a really timely book. And from time to time, the Regent Bookstore hosts these conversations with authors about their books. It's always great fun to talk to an author about their ideas and probe further. So welcome to this. We're going to have a time where I'm going to be in dialogue with today's author for a little while, and then we'll be able to take your questions wherever you are around the world by email. You can send them in, and we'll have a chance to hear from you as our viewing audience and take some of your questions too. So that's how we'll operate here today, and it is my great delight to introduce you to Dr. John Lennox, who's coming to us from Oxford, outside of Oxford in the UK. I'm in Vancouver, BC, wherever you are. Welcome to this. So let me briefly introduce our guest here today, John Lennox. He is someone who's taught at Regent Summer Schools in the past and is a kind of extended friend of the college, so has agreed to have this conversation. He's Professor of Mathematics Emeritus at Oxford University and is very well known for his work on the intersection of science and faith, and generally for the work of an intellectual, credible defense of Christianity in today's world. He comes to us originally from Northern Ireland and then took a extended period of study at Cambridge University, leading to a doctor of philosophy in the mathematics. And in my research for this time together, I have dug up the truth that he is an expert in group theory in mathematics. Now, I have no idea what that is, by the way, and even the author of a book, which is called Subnormal Subgroups of Groups. Now, it would take the entire time we have today for him probably to understand the title of that, explain the title of that book. So we'll leave his mathematical accomplishments and long history of lecturing around the world in mathematics slightly to the side just for now, to focus on his work in this intersection of faith and contemporary culture, philosophy, religion. He's debated a number of the leading proponents of atheism in different forums, and has written a number of different books in the last couple of decades that are trying to encompass a winsome apologetic for Christianity. So with that introduction, welcome, John, and we're really delighted to have you with us.
Well, it's lovely to be back in BC. I think you've got a marvelous campus up there. What I remember so clearly is seeing the eagles. And that's a vivid memory of Vancouver.
Well, it was great. I remember our last conversation was in the atrium of Regent on a beautiful sunny day, and many people that are viewing this are familiar with that beautiful space and have watched the eagles that we're very blessed to have in this neck of the woods here. So you're in somewhere near Oxford. And what has this pandemic experience been for you over these last months?
Well, for me, it's been lockdown. I'm in the vulnerable mid-70s with my wife, and we live in a small village about 20 minutes drive outside Oxford. And because of our general health, we were advised essentially to lock down. But it's been an immensely productive period in terms of writing, because not only have I written the book that we're going to discuss this evening, but I have taken the opportunity to revisit some of the books that I've written that have been out for 10 years ago, for 10 years or so. And I have substantially rewritten 3 of them. And that has been a very useful thing, as well as working on a new project. And that is an autobiography, which I've hesitated to do for many years, but eventually I've been persuaded to put something together. So it's been very active. And I've been able to keep in touch with many people by Skype and telephone. It's very different, but the technology has really come, so to speak, to my rescue, because I've not ceased communicating ideas out into cyberspace, at least.
Well, that's great. There's new opportunities as well as a sense of loss and restriction with all of this.
That's right.
And so you've been doing a lot of Zoom calls and discussions with people around this book. So tell us a little bit about those.
Well, I haven't counted, but I think we're up to nearly 80 interviews on the coronavirus book and over 40 on another book that I wrote last year. And they've been all over the world with all kinds of people interviewing me. Some are Christian, some are secular. And it's been great opportunity to explore ideas. I actually like the medium, and the technology seems to work almost flawlessly. So that's what I've been doing. And this is the third session today, I think.
Well, we don't want to work you too hard. It's evening already
It's okay.
in the UK. Um, as we think about this little book, and viewers, this is the book, and you can obtain it through the Regent Bookstore. If you contact them, they'd be glad to send you one, or you could come by the store and pick it up if you're in Vancouver, and it is very widely available. So right off the bat, I'm looking at page 5 in the introduction, you say, I would invite you, the reader, to view the book like this. I'm sitting with you in a coffee shop. If only we could. And you've asked me the question on the book cover. I put down my coffee cup and attempt to give you an honest answer. Well, it sounds like you'd really prefer to be having coffee with each of our viewers, which would be lovely. And I want to eventually get us to the point to really have you tell us the answer to the question you're posing here. But before we get there, where did the idea of writing this book come from? How did you, and was it an agonizing decision to write this book, or did it
Not
just?
in the slightest, no. It was a very rapid decision that partly comes from the fact that I'm a mathematician. And when our government announced lockdown and all of this, I'm in a college in Oxford that has a lot of world-class epidemiologists and statisticians. But in any case, I know enough about maths to realize that this was going to go viral around the globe and increase exponentially, which would be really scary. And I thought, if I'm going to be locked down, is there anything that I can do that might be an input? And it occurred to me on a Monday morning that really one ought to try to approach this seriously from a Christian perspective, to demonstrate not only to Christians that there's real comfort to be found in their Christian convictions, but also to try to show that Christianity actually has something credible, non-simplistic, non-trivial, not cheap, but something to say that ought to be put into the pool of anybody's thinking with all the different worldviews competing out there. So I sat down the Monday morning and worked intensively. It all seemed to flow. It was quite remarkable until Saturday evening, when I sent it to a publisher, and it was in print by Wednesday. And that must be a world record. It's
Well,
now actually gone around the world, 27 languages, I'm told.
yes, no, that is remarkable. I mean, that's got to be the fastest you've ever written a book. Is that right?
Oh, yes, absolutely the fastest. And I could see you can refine these things endlessly, but I thought, look, this reads well enough. I had several medically qualified people read through it, of course, before it went into print, and that all happened in the 1 week. And I thought, let's get it out there and see what discussion follows. And an enormous amount of discussion has followed. So I find it really very encouraging.
Yeah, 27 languages is quite remarkable. And as you were spending that week writing this book, what was the biggest challenge in the writing of it? What did you feel like you had to overcome in order to pull this together?
The biggest challenge in writing any book is thought flow, is getting the logic of it right so that it flows, that it tells a story, and that it's accessible. And the publisher was very keen that it must not exceed 64 pages. And for me, it would have been easier to write 164 pages, but I wasn't allowed to do that. And quite rightly not. You can't go into every detail. So the decision that had to be made is, what are the major issues? How can I link them together in a credible thought flow that people will follow, and make it accessible and friendly? Hence the coffee cup at the beginning, which I really did intend seriously,
Right.
to have a chat with people rather than coming at them with some weighty tome that bores them to death, frankly.
Well, it's not a weighty tome. It's not boring. It's completely timely to all the issues that a lot of people are asking, whether they're religious people or non-religious people. And so who particularly, speaking of that audience, who particularly did you have in mind in writing this book?
Well, two audiences, in a sense. Firstly, Christians, because suffering and evil really create very big questions. And they're of two kinds. If you're actually suffering, what you need is care and warmth and friendship and fellowship. If you're simply observing the suffering, as many of us are doing, then often the questions are much more intellectual, and we're demanding answers. But of course, people who are suffering are doing that. And then in general, because that applies not only to Christians, but to everybody, this is the hardest question any worldview faces.
Mm.
And therefore, I felt that an objective was to share as a Christian explicitly, but to try and keep it as jargon free as possible, so that people of different worldviews might stop and think, actually, Christianity may well have something to say, even to me.
Mm.
And of course, the extreme opposite is the atheist view that coronavirus and catastrophes like earthquakes simply prove God doesn't exist. And so to try and deal with a whole spectrum of views was difficult in a short space, but I give it a shot.
Well, it's a great shot and very helpful, and that worldwide readership is testimony that it's striking a nerve, I think, with people, and providing something that's really, really helpful. So one of the things that struck me in the book is that your first chapter, the title is Feeling Vulnerable. So you start out this journey with the whole idea of vulnerability. You talk about some of your own encounter with vulnerability through a kind of health scare you had some years back. So why did you start off with the theme of feeling vulnerable? What vulnerabilities are we really experiencing here in this coronavirus world?
Well, I started off with vulnerability because that's what everybody was talking about.
No.
After all, it's the 21st century. We thought medicine had beaten these things. This is the Black Death, or it's the Spanish flu in the early part of the century, or it's a bit like SARS, but it turns out to be far worse than SARS because it can be carried without the carrier being aware of it. And therefore, we discover once again that we're not as indestructible as we thought. And so the deep questions of vulnerability leading on to mortality, death, and then, of course, the question of God and eternity is very close to those. So I started where I felt the public mood was.
Yeah, and your own sense of vulnerability, as you say, you're in lockdown, you're in a vulnerable age group, you've had some other health scares. I wonder whether this sort of realization of our vulnerability is maybe one of the main lessons of the whole coronavirus experience, which is going on and on. It's not also over. When you wrote this, it was probably in March, is that right? When you
Oh, I wrote it right at the beginning of lockdown, where there were relatively few deaths.
Yeah.
I mean, what has happened subsequently, I could rewrite the book now and make it a little bit more accurate, but
Yeah.
it does reveal that this was the very early stages, and none of us had any idea of the chaos it was going to unleash and the pressure it was going to put on hospitals and medical people and care homes.
Yeah, yeah. I think maybe this is one of the lessons that is good for all of us to reflect on personally, and even in churches, for those who are part of that, is how are we living with our vulnerability, which we've now encountered afresh?
I think it's right, because C.S. Lewis, whom I quote in the book, said years ago that pain is God's megaphone. It's a wake-up call. And I would say, simply from observing what's going on in our culture today, that that's obviously been the response. Talking to various ministers of churches whom I know, they tell me that the online church attendance has been many multiples of normal church attendance. And that's because people are sensing vulnerability, and it is forcing them to ask the really big questions. And they want to hear what Christianity has to say, which is a very positive outcome.
Yeah. And now along the way, you're taking up these questions of what worldviews can really account for suffering. You say that's one of the biggest issues really for any worldview, is accounting for sufferings.
Yes.
So you have a chapter 3, just to move ahead a little bit. Can atheism help? I think the answer is primarily not very helpful. Is that right? So tell us your thought about the capacity of non-Christian worldviews to address these issues of suffering and vulnerability and ultimately death.
Well, the main reactions I had experienced some years ago, because I arrived in New Zealand just a few days after the earthquake. And the reactions were very varied. There were the Christians who felt, well, nothing's going to shake me, even if the mountains fall into the sea. There were the atheists said, well, just face it. This is what the universe is like. There is no God, and you better get used to it. We can do nothing about it. And then there were the intermediate views, where on the one hand, you had some Christians saying, well, this is the judgment of God. And very similar to that, actually, some of the pantheistic worldviews were saying, well, actually, the people who are suffering, this is a result of their karma. They didn't behave in a previous incarnation. And unfortunately, if you help them, you are condemning them to have another, possibly even worse reincarnation the next time round, which is a massively cruel doctrine. But that's the spectrum. And you mentioned atheism. And I suppose my first reaction is my atheist friends, think that they've solved the problem. That is just how the universe is. It's a brute fact. And nature doesn't care for us anyway. And as Richard Dawkins put it, the universe is just what you'd expect. If at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. A very famous quote. He's very good with language. So his universe has no good and no evil, which is a very odd view to take if you talk about the problem of evil. It abolishes the concepts of good and evil. And that's one of my major criticisms of atheism. It undermines the very criticism that people want to make. But you see, it claims to be an intellectual solution. That's just how the world is. But it doesn't get rid of the suffering. That's still there. But what it does get rid of, by definition, is all ultimate hope. Because by definition, atheism tells us that life ends with death. So to the person suffering with COVID or dying from COVID, atheism has absolutely nothing to say. And I once said to Dawkins, as I recall, it's pretty grim. And he said, yes, it's very grim, but that doesn't prove it's false. I said, yes, but it doesn't prove it's true either. And what we find is that every human being, whatever their worldview, does have a sense of morality, does have a desire for justice. And unless we're going to conclude that that sense is a total illusion, then we have to raise the question, where is it coming from, that sense of justice? And how are we going to make sense of the world? Now, of course, that creates a real problem. But I believe we're getting somewhere, because if we give and open the possibility in our minds that there's a theological dimension and start thinking about God, then of course there are going to be intellectual questions. But Christianity, I believe, comes in here with a real hope because at the heart of Christianity is a solution to the problem of death.
Mm.
And that is a magnificent thing. And to try to get that across credibly was one of my major concerns.
Mm, mm, mm. Well, with a kind of Dawkins universe, is there any role for meaning? Meaning seems to also go out the door, right? There's no good, there's no evil, things just are. What is. Don't look for meaning or
Yes,
purpose, right?
that's correct. I remember being at a launch of a book by Paul Davis, actually in London, and Dawkins was there, and some hapless chap in the audience asked the question, why? And Dawkins said, that's a meaningless question. And there was a complete intake of incredulity in the audience. But this is the logical consequence, that they are left in a meaningless universe. Because if you are like him and believe that science is the only way to truth, then of course you're only touching a part of the world as we find it. You can't ask a why question of purpose or meaning in most definitions of science, and yet all humans ask those questions, and that they actually the most important questions. And the great scientists, some of the brilliant Nobel Prize winners we've had, have seen that very clearly, that science doesn't answer all questions, and we have to turn to religion, philosophy, and so on to begin to answer those questions. And here is where I want to put in the fact that rationality doesn't end with science. Christianity gives a perfectly rational understanding of the concepts of meaning that we so desperately need.
Mm. Thank you. In this chapter, you talk a little bit about the distinction between moral evil and natural evil, which is raising also the question about God's sovereignty, which is
Yes.
another theme that you've written about and thought a lot about. And so from the standpoint of some critics of Christianity, the idea is, of course, well, I thought you folks said that God was in control of the world, and yet disaster is everywhere. People are dying all over the world. If God is withdrawn, he's certainly not sovereign. So could you help people unpack a little bit about what's a better way to think about that?
Well, that's a deeper question. And I often say to people, look, at least listen to what the Bible has to say in full before you dismiss the idea. And we start with those two kinds of evil. The word evil isn't really a opposite here, because moral evil are the bad things that people do to each other. What we call natural evil are things like catastrophes and COVID, where we don't directly see humans behind it. And those two kinds of things, I say, look, there appears to be a fracture in human nature, that's moral evil, and a fracture in physical nature. Now, the very interesting thing is the Bible connects them at the very beginning in Genesis. They are connected in some deep way. And what Paul says about it in Romans is that as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death passed upon all man, that is all human beings, for that all have sinned. In other words, there's a physical consequence of that first moral trespass. It damaged the world, it damaged human physical life, but God also told them that the land was going to yield food, yes, but thorns and thistles, there were going to be all sorts of problems. So that something has happened. There's been a fracture in nature. And we've got to come to terms with that. Now, the next question down is, okay, but don't you claim that God is sovereign? Why does he not immediately step in and stop it? Well, why couldn't he have made a world in which things didn't go wrong? My answer to that is, of course, he could have made a world in which no such thing happened, but you would not have been in it. And when I say that, many people say, what do you mean I would not have been in it? Well, I said, the most precious thing about you, according to how I understand it, is your capacity to be able to respond with a yes or a no. And that's what makes love possible. That's what makes morality possible. A robot that's purely deterministic cannot love and is totally amoral. So if you wish for a universe that's a robotic universe where nothing ever goes wrong, where the concept doesn't even exist, well, of course, we can make universes like that, let alone God. But as I say, you're wishing yourself out of existence. And people come back to me and say, well, are you saying God took a risk? Well, I said, have you got any children? I can remember my first child holding the little girl and suddenly realizing, I just don't know why, standing in the hospital, you know, little girl, you could grow up to reject me. Now, why have children? Well, we all know the answer to that because we feel that if we're Christians, especially, that with God's help, we can reap a harvest of love and friendship and family life that is infinitely precious. But still, it does happen. Children rebel against their parents. So the next logical question, I'm probably going on too long here, is granted that there was risk, and C.S. Lewis writes very sensibly about all of this kind of thing. You see, God has to allow these things to have their consequences because, as Lewis pointed out, if he reversed, for example, if I were about to tell you a lie and God stopped the air carrying the waves from my voice, that in the end reduces me to a deterministic robot and removes all humanity. So the world is the way it is for deep moral and spiritual reasons. So the most important question is, granted that it is so, and none of us can solve the endless undergraduate and student question, surely a good God should, if he's all powerful, be able to do this and that. And we've never come to a satisfactory conclusion. And that has led me to say this, look, perhaps there's another question we can ask where we can get further. And the other question I believe we can ask is, granted that it's like that, any worldview has to take that on board. We're faced with a mixed picture. I call it beauty and bombs or beauty and barbed wire. There's a mixed picture, beauty and COVID-19. Then the key question is this: is there anywhere evidence that there is a God that we could trust with it? That's not an easy question, but I believe that points us into the very heart of what Christianity has to say.
No, that's very, very helpful, John. Thank you very much. What would you say to, I'm just thinking about all the different folks who have been writing about coronavirus and trying to respond to it. And as we all have been following whatever media that we follow and whatever sources that we have, lots of people have been talking about this. Some Christian writers have been trying to emphasize, in a sense, this idea of suffering, even through things like COVID and disease, are a kind of form of God's judgment upon us. What do you say in response to those that take the kind of judgment interpretation?
Well, I say, be very careful, because we have guidance about that. Now, of course, Scripture tells us that it is possible that a person who's suffering is experiencing some kind of discipline from God. Scripture says that. But in general, the basic principles was taught by Jesus himself in Luke 13, and it's a most illuminating, very short episode where he's on the Temple Mountain. And people in the crowd say, Lord, and I'm just paraphrasing, Lord, this is the place where Pilate came out and massacred a whole crowd of people at worship. That's moral evil. And Jesus says to them, yes. And do you think they were any worse than anybody else in Jerusalem at the time? I tell you, they were not. And then, amazingly, he adds another incident. And he said, are the 18 on whom the tower of Siloam fell, Do you think they were any worse than anybody else? I tell you, they were not. Now, he has an added phrase, but let's just look at those two for a moment. And as I analyze that, the massacre was terrible for those involved. It was small scale, though. Similarly, the fall of the tower, but the principle is the same, because COVID-19, although global, it is a collection of small scale tragedies for the families involved. Now, what is Jesus saying? I think he's very clearly saying this: when you see that kind of tragedy, moral evil, or a catastrophe, the collapse of a tower, you cannot necessarily conclude that they are worse than somebody else and suffering because God is judging them. And what I noticed, Jeff, it's very interesting, and I noticed this in New Zealand, that when professing Christians take that view, it doesn't lead people to think about God at all. It makes them mad, because they just turn around and they said, who do you think you are telling us that you think God's judging these people? What about yourself? So it doesn't do any good whatsoever. But what Jesus said at the end of that incident, he said this: except you all repent, you shall all likewise perish. Now, of course, he didn't mean that you've got a choice of how you die, either be massacred in church or a tower will fall on you. But I think what he meant was, these tragedies raise the question of mortality. And 1 out of 1 of us is going to die. You need to think about that, because when it comes to God's standards, all of us fall under God's judgment in that sense. So what we need to do is take seriously the matter of eternity and the fact we're going to meet God, and we need to repent. Now that makes sense to me, because that's exactly the effect that COVID-19 is happening, at least in the UK, with the increased numbers on online churches. People want to know what the implication is. So that's my reaction, but I don't deny that in certain cases, people suffer because they've sinned. But there's another side to that. Sometimes they suffer when they haven't. Job is a classic case, one of the biggest biblical books devoted to the topic. We need to be extremely careful with our analyses here, because we can do a huge amount of damage if we're not careful.
Now, another route that interpreters have been going, some, I mean, I suppose Tom Wright is one of the ones that's taken the kind of approach that I'm suggesting here, which is to say this is mostly a time for lament. It's a time for asking why are you absent, God? Why aren't you stopping this? And to, in a sense, enter into the suffering and disappointment of so many people, rather than, in a sense, trying to give an answer, or even saying, well, Christianity really doesn't have an answer to this. What's your response to that approach to handling this?
Well, it's to say that an eagle of the type that flies around your campus needs 2 wings to fly. And I think that's an overreaction to the other side. Let me put it this way. There's a wonderful story in John chapter 11 that illustrates both sides of this beautifully. It's the story of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, a tiny nuclear family. Lazarus is desperately ill. They know Jesus. He's a family friend. So the sisters send a message: Lord, the one you love is ill. And he doesn't come. So they watch him die and go through all the deep emotion that involves. And then Jesus turns up. And that must have created consternation. What on earth is he going to say? Why did he let him die? I mean, that's the COVID problem. If there is a God, why does he let people die? Well, why did Jesus let Lazarus die? So Martha is the first to meet him. And she says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Now, that's a very interesting statement, because she's saying, I believe you have the power. The problem was you weren't here. Were you socially isolating? Were you in lockdown? Where were you, you see? So that again is the COVID question. And he said, well, Martha, your brother will rise again. Oh, yes, she said, I know that. My theology is okay. He'll rise again, the resurrection of the last day. Jesus said, I didn't quite mean that. Martha, I am the resurrection. That was a stunning claim. I am the resurrection and the life. A man, even if he dies, if he believes in me, shall not die, you see, ultimately, but have eternal life. But at that point, she recalled her sister, and Mary came. She said the same words, word for word identical. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And then she began to cry. And what did Jesus do? He didn't engage in an intellectual firestorm about the resurrection. He wept. Now, I think that is the side that Tom Wright is emphasizing. And it's a vastly important side. I've thought often of if, say, my wife had this illness and I wasn't even allowed to touch her before we said goodbye, that must be absolutely terrible. People want to touch. They want tears. And I think we need to learn to lament, absolutely, and to allow people to pour out their hearts and criticize God if they want to, as many of the Psalms seem to do. And people find comfort in that. But I think it's not either or, it's both and. And you see that in Martha. She had an intellectual question. The Lord gave her a very well thought out argument. And Mary, she was deeply emotionally disturbed, and he answered it by showing he sympathized. Now, if we wanted to analyze that further, the next question to ask is, were those crocodile tears or were they real? Well, Jesus proceeded to raise Lazarus from the dead, and then he went to the cross for all three of them and the rest of us who trust him. And he wept, so to speak, over Jerusalem, and he bore our sins. And this is the very deep, mysterious thing that lies at the heart of Christianity, how that could possibly ever happen and have the effect it has had. So that is my reaction to that kind of thing. We need both. We need to do exactly what Jesus did, is make a differential diagnosis of the temperament of the people we're talking to and where they're coming from.
John, that's really, really helpful. Now, in terms of the answer that you give to the question that is your title, where is God in a coronavirus world? I want to two questions for you, really. Start with this one. A coronavirus world. One of the things that you interestingly say along here, you've got a quote from a scientist who's talking about viruses are our smallest unsung heroes. And you talk a bit about also at a much bigger scale, tectonic plates. So we live in a world where there's lots of viruses, including occasionally novel coronaviruses, and we live in a world where there are tectonic plates, where there are things like earthquakes and tsunamis as a result of that. This is the creation that we have. So why did you think that was an important point to bring out in this conversation?
It was designed to show that this question is much more complex than we often realize, because both tectonic plates and viruses are necessary for life. And it's odd that on my way to New Zealand on the plane, I was reading a chapter of a book on tectonic plates and discovered they're absolutely necessary for life. Now, here's the thing. Could God not have made a world? And we're back to the other question. And in the end, we're faced, to quote your words, this is the way the world is. And there's a sense in which we cannot get beneath that. Questions like, couldn't God have made fire that warmed us but never burned? Couldn't he make electricity that wasn't dangerous? And all this sort of stuff. Couldn't he have viruses that were all good? Very few of them are pathogenic, of course. And the thing is, we just don't have all the answers, but we're faced with that situation. So either we use it to deny God, which doesn't really get us very far, or we ask the question I asked a few minutes ago. In spite of that, is there enough evidence to trust God with it. And I think that is where the cross, seeing what Jesus did in the cross and his resurrection, that changes the whole perspective, because it means death is not the end. And he has promised to those who trust him that death will not be the end for them either.
Yeah, that's the other part of it, the where is God in a coronavirus world. I think a very important part of your answer to that, and I'm going to give you a chance to kind of spell out your answer in straightforward terms, but what struck me is that throughout the book, from really beginning to end, one of the things that you connect with a number of times is just this idea that God himself suffers. And I just recalling, this question of, if God is all good and all powerful, why is there evil in the world? That sort of philosophical framing. I remember as an undergraduate in a philosophy class encountering that question, and it was meant to be on an exam, and we had to come up with what's our answer to that. And I thought, well, in those terms, you can't really answer the question, can you? But the difference, I think, in Christianity is we recognize that God himself suffers. And as a theme in your book, that's actually a very significant thread throughout. So how does that insight help you answer this question about where is God in a coronavirus world?
Well, there's a sense in which I could have answered that question, though I don't in the book because I thought about it afterwards, that God is exactly where he was in the world before coronavirus. That is, he's offering us his friendship, his fellowship, his forgiveness, his peace, and a new life through Jesus Christ. But the special point is that why would we trust God with this? Because God knows what it's like to suffer. Because on the cross, Jesus suffered. And we can't begin to understand that. I mean, we can see what it involved physically, but what it involved spiritually, that goes beyond all our understanding. And I've said to many people, look, the central Christian claim is that Jesus is God incarnate. Now, if that is the case, just try and come with me for a minute. What is God, in that sense, doing on a cross? Well, surely, at the very least, it shows us that God has not remained distant from the question of suffering, but has himself become part of it. Mm-hmm. And I've often found that even saying that simply like that has begun to open a window in people's minds and hearts, that they begin to sense that God cares. Mm-hmm. He understands. Although it's very difficult to articulate it, it seems to me to be a central part of the Christian gospel. He suffered, and therefore he can draw alongside people who are suffering.
Right. Such a beautiful insight and powerful one. I'm reminded of the quote that's originally, I believe, from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that only a suffering God can help. And that's
right.
The face of the Holocaust. He's saying that thing. This is God himself suffering on behalf and with and for his own people.
Yes. There'll always be a residual mystery. I mean, I will go, if COVID-19 takes me into eternity, it's not that I've solved all the questions, Jeff. And I like to stress that with people. There are all kinds of residual questions we have. But I've learned enough in life to really be convinced that I can trust God with this because of Christ. And one day, doubtless, he'll explain it all to us, but there's still going to be questions.
Yeah. No, there's always room for faith and trust, and we're invited by faith into trust of that God who has suffered for us and risen for us as well. And that's good news. Well, John, thank you very much for this conversation. I want to say what a privilege it is to engage with you and to wrestle with these questions. These are questions of today's world. And meanwhile, you also mentioned you're doing a whole variety of Zoom conversations around another book that you've done. So people hearing this might say, oh, I wonder what that other book's about. Tell us about this book called 2084. Do you have one to hold up? There we go.
I do, yes.
Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity.
That's it, yes.
There you go. So tell us where did that come from and what is the main idea there?
Well, the main idea there is to take off from George Orwell's book 1984, which was a famous dystopia where he talked about Big Brother and all the rest of it. And I start there because one of the uses of artificial intelligence today that's really operating and becoming a bit scary in some parts of the world is surveillance technology. Big Brother is very much with us. And there are reports from various places in the world that minority ethnic groups are actually being essentially controlled by these surveillance techniques. Now, what I wanted to do was this. I wanted to demystify AI for general readers, whether they're Christians or not, to make a very clear distinction from narrow artificial intelligence, which is the stuff that actually works at the moment, which is really a system that does one single thing, does it well, a single thing that normally requires human intelligence. But then there's the much more speculative aspect, and that is artificial general intelligence. And as the name suggests, that is the quest to develop super intelligence, to make an AI system that can do everything that humans can do, only do it much better. And that is, of course, a realm where there's a huge amount of speculation and films and all that kind of stuff about it. And what I wanted to do was to try to show people the good things that are being done and to encourage bright young Christians who are in science to get involved with this, because A, they can make a very positive contribution to the science, and B, if they've got Christian convictions, they can help analyze the significance, the upsides, the downsides, and particularly the ethics of all of this for the rest of us. And also, I wanted to, towards the end of the book, draw people's attention to the fact that the Bible actually talks about the future. And if we're prepared to listen to all kinds of speculative scenarios for which there's very little evidence, perhaps it's time to revisit some of the things the Bible says. But I'm not going to do any more spoilers of that. The book is already out in North America, and there's a special website, 2084thebook.com. It's got its own website where you can look up and see what it's all about.
Well, that's a really wonderful introduction, kind of a teaser into that book, and our viewers can chase that down as well. The Regent Bookstore would be glad to help you with that. The Regent Bookstore has the Where is God in a Coronavirus World as well. Just give them a call or email them in terms of that order. And John, let's plan down the road to have a conversation around 2084. And
I'd be glad to do that.
That was such an important topic. It seems like science fiction, but it's increasingly the world that we do live in. And it's good for us to think Christianly and critically about those issues you're raising there too. So we look forward to that, and really just want to thank you for a really great conversation about your little book, Where is God in a Coronavirus World? And may it go around the world in all those 27 languages and have a really wonderful impact. And thank you very much for writing it. And thank you for talking to us today about it.
My pleasure.
We'll see you again soon. Thanks very much. Thank you everybody for joining us today. On behalf of the Regent Bookstore, have a great day, a great evening, and God bless.